close your eyes for a moment and consider this thought. What if the strongest feeling you have ever experienced was never random at all? Love is often described as chance, a coincidence. The right person at the right time in the right place. But what if love is not a mystery of the heart, but a decision made deep inside the brain, long before you are even aware of it? What if attraction is not magic, but an ancient biological pattern designed to guide you towards specific people and away from others? Tonight, you are not here to hear a romantic story. You are here to listen to science, told slowly, calmly, in a way that allows your mind to relax. Why do certain voices feel safe? Why does one face feel familiar, even when you have never seen it before? And why can love feel so powerful that it overrides logic, memory, and reason? Because love is not just an emotion, it is a chemical sequence, a precise interaction between dopamine, oxytocin, and memory, a reward system shaped by millions of years of evolution. As you listen, your thoughts will begin to slow, your breathing will soften, and understanding will gently replace effort. You do not need to stay awake, you only need to listen, because tonight you will discover something most people never realize. Asterisk, asterisk, love is not random. Asterisk, asterisk, love does not begin in the heart, and it does not begin with emotion the way we are taught to believe. It begins silently, inside the brain, long before you are aware that anything is happening at all. Before a feeling forms, before attraction has a name, the brain is already running ancient calculations designed to evaluate safety, familiarity, and reward. This process is not poetic or romantic. It is biological, automatic, and deeply rooted in survival. The moment you notice someone, your brain has already scanned their voice, their face, their movement, and compared them to patterns stored across years of memory. What feels like a sudden spark is actually recognition happening below consciousness. Deep within the brain, regions that evolved millions of years before language begin to activate. The amygdala assesses emotional relevance, not asking whether someone is attractive, but whether they feel important. The hypothalamus quietly prepares hormonal responses, adjusting the body for connection, attention, and anticipation. At the same time, memory networks search for familiarity, linking the present moment to fragments of the past you may no longer remember consciously. A certain tone of voice may echo childhood safety, a facial expression may resemble trust, and a rhythm of speech may signal comfort. Love begins as pattern matching, not choice. This is why attraction often feels irrational. You may not logically understand why one person feels magnetic while another does not, even when both appear similar on the surface. The brain does not prioritize logic when forming bonds. It prioritizes efficiency. It relies on shortcuts shaped by experience, emotion, and biology. These shortcuts allow the brain to decide quickly who matters and who does not. What you experience as intuition is the result of countless unconscious evaluations happening faster than thought itself. By the time you feel your heart respond, the brain has already committed resources. Attention narrows. Time feels different. Dopamine begins to shape motivation, pulling your focus toward one person again and again. This is not accidental, and it is not random. It is the brain's reward system responding to a perceived opportunity for connection, meaning, or continuity. Love, at its core, is the brain signaling that something or someone is worth energy, memory, and emotional investment. When people say they fell in love, what they are really describing is the moment awareness catches up with biology. The brain has already chosen, already reacted, already begun the process of attachment. Conscious thought arrives later, trying to explain a decision that has already been made. The heart becomes the symbol, but the brain is the origin. And once you understand this, love becomes less mysterious, less chaotic, and strangely more peaceful, because it was never random to begin with. Inside the brain, love begins as a prioritization problem. The mind is constantly flooded with faces, sounds, movements, and information, yet only a few people ever rise above the background noise. This elevation is not emotional at first. It is neurological. The brain assigns value before meaning, deciding what deserves attention and what can be ignored. When someone suddenly feels important, it is because neural systems responsible for relevance and reward have quietly agreed that this person matters more than the rest. Love starts when attention becomes selective, when the brain narrows the world and chooses one signal over thousands of others. This selection process is deeply influenced by prediction. The brain is a machine built to anticipate outcomes, and when it encounters someone whose presence feels predictable in a comforting way, neural tension decreases. Familiar rhythms, familiar emotional cues, familiar patterns of interaction all reduce cognitive effort. The brain interprets this reduction in effort as safety, and safety is one of the strongest foundations for attachment. Even excitement often emerges from controlled uncertainty, not chaos. Love grows where the brain feels both stimulated and stable, where novelty does not threaten coherence. As this internal assessment continues, the brain begins to allocate chemical resources. Dopamine increases motivation and focus, making thoughts return repeatedly to the same person without conscious intent. This repetition strengthens neural pathways, reinforcing interest with every mental revisit. Memory becomes biased, highlighting moments associated with this individual while dimming irrelevant details. What feels like obsession forming is actually the brain optimizing its internal map, reshaping priorities to reflect a new emotional landmark. At the same time, the brain subtly adjusts perception. Flaws soften, neutral expressions appear warmer, ordinary gestures gain emotional weight. This is not illusion in the romantic sense. It is neural efficiency. The brain amplifies signals that support the bond it is forming, filtering reality in a way that maintains internal consistency. Love feels immersive because the brain is aligning perception, memory, and motivation around a single focal point. Reality does not change, interpretation does. By the time love reaches awareness, the brain has already invested energy, chemistry, and structure into the connection. What you experience as falling is actually settling into a pattern that has been forming quietly all along. The mind is not surprised, consciousness is. And as understanding replaces confusion, the nervous system can begin to rest. Because love, at its origin, is not chaos, it is organization. A slow, deliberate alignment of attention, chemistry, and meaning that begins in silence and unfolds without urgency. As love settles deeper into the brain, it begins to reshape the way time is experienced. Moments connected to a specific person stretch, slow down, and leave stronger impressions, while unrelated experiences fade into the background more quickly than usual. This is not imagination or emotional exaggeration. It is the hippocampus reorganizing memory based on perceived importance. The brain does not store events equally. It prioritizes what it believes will matter in the future, and love signals relevance more strongly than almost anything else. A single interaction can outweigh dozens of neutral ones, simply because the brain has decided that this connection deserves preservation. With repetition, neural pathways grow more efficient. Thoughts travel familiar routes with less resistance, returning again and again to the same images, the same voice, the same presence. This repetition feels effortless, almost soothing, even when the content is emotionally intense. The brain prefers what is easy to process, and familiarity creates ease. Over time, this ease becomes comfort, and comfort becomes attachment. Love strengthens not through constant excitement, but through the quiet reinforcement of neural familiarity, the gentle reassurance that this mental pathway is safe to travel. As attachment deepens, the brain begins to integrate the other person into its internal sense of self. Neural networks responsible for identity and social belonging start to overlap, subtly blurring boundaries. The brain no longer treats the loved one as separate information, but as part of its own extended system. Their presence affects emotional regulation, stress responses, and even physical sensations. When they are near, the nervous system relaxes more easily. When they are absent, the brain notices the gap, not as loss, but as missing structure. Love, at this stage, becomes a form of internal organization. This integration explains why love can feel grounding rather than chaotic when it is secure. The brain thrives on stability, and when a bond feels reliable, it reduces the need for constant vigilance. Cortisol levels soften, breathing patterns slow, and the body shifts toward rest rather than alertness. Love becomes a regulatory force, quietly supporting balance rather than demanding attention. In this state, love does not overwhelm consciousness. It supports it, allowing thought to slow, awareness to soften, and sleep to come more easily. Understanding this process removes the urgency often associated with love. There is no rush inside the brain, no dramatic countdown, no sudden leap. Everything unfolds gradually, layer by layer, as neural systems adapt and recalibrate. Love grows the way habits grow, the way familiarity deepens, the way the mind learns where it belongs. And as you listen to this, allowing the information to drift rather than settle sharply, your own brain begins to mirror that rhythm, slowing, organizing, releasing effort, preparing itself not to fall, but to rest. As love stabilizes in the brain, it quietly rewires expectation. The mind begins to anticipate presence, predict reactions, and fill future moments with a specific person without conscious effort. This anticipation is not fantasy, it is neural efficiency. The brain prefers continuity, and once it identifies a bond as meaningful, it adjusts its internal forecasts accordingly. Thoughts about tomorrow, next week, or distant times subtly reorganize themselves around this connection, making love feel inevitable rather than chosen. This sense of inevitability comes from repetition reinforced by chemistry. Each remembered interaction strengthens neural loops associated with reward and familiarity, making the bond feel increasingly natural. Over time, the brain stops questioning the connection and starts assuming it. This assumption creates emotional gravity, a pull that does not need constant stimulation to remain strong. Love feels steady not because it is intense, but because the brain has accepted it as part of its internal structure. At this stage, the brain also begins to filter external information differently. Competing stimuli lose importance, distractions soften, and attention becomes more selective. This narrowing is often mistaken for obsession, but it is actually optimization. The brain conserves energy by focusing on what it believes matters most. Love simplifies the mental landscape, reducing noise and complexity, allowing the mind to rest more easily within a smaller, calmer emotional space. The nervous system responds accordingly. Heart rate variability improves, muscle tension decreases, and breathing becomes deeper when the bond feels secure. Love shifts the body from vigilance to regulation. In this way, love is not arousing but soothing. It does not keep the brain awake. It gives the brain permission to let go. This is why thoughts of someone you trust can make sleep come faster rather than delay it. When love is rooted in neural safety, it becomes quiet. There is less urgency to prove, chase, or hold tightly. The brain does not need to defend the bond, it simply maintains it. This quietness is often misunderstood as fading passion, but in reality, it is integration. Love has moved from excitement into structure, from novelty into stability, from effort into presence. This is where love stops feeling dramatic and starts feeling real. The brain no longer floods consciousness with signals demanding attention. Instead, it supports the bond in the background, allowing awareness to drift elsewhere. Love becomes something you rest inside rather than something you reach for. And in that resting space, the mind finds balance instead of intensity. As you listen now, your own brain recognizes this pattern. Information slows, meaning softens, and effort dissolves. Understanding does not require focus, it arrives naturally. Love, at its origin, is not chaos or mystery, it is alignment. And alignment, once established, allows both the brain and the body to finally release control and move gently towards sleep. What we call chance is often nothing more than a gap in awareness. The brain experiences events in layers, and only a small portion of those layers ever reach consciousness. When two people meet and feel an immediate connection, the mind fills the silence with the idea of coincidence, because coincidence feels simple and comforting. Yet beneath that simplicity, the brain has already been preparing for this moment through patterns shaped over years of experience. Attraction appears sudden only because the preparation happened quietly, outside of attention. The brain is constantly predicting outcomes based on past information. Long before two people cross paths, neural systems have already formed expectations about what connection should feel like. Tone of voice, emotional rhythm, facial expression, and even subtle body language are compared against internal templates built from earlier relationships and attachments. When a person aligns closely with these templates, the brain reacts with recognition. This recognition feels effortless, natural, and often deeply emotional, even though it is the result of long-term neural conditioning rather than randomness. Chance feels real because the brain hides its work well. It does not announce why it prefers one person over another. It simply generates a sensation of interest, comfort, or curiosity, and lets consciousness create a story around it. Words like destiny, timing, or fate emerge as explanations because they match the emotional weight of the experience. the truth is quieter and less dramatic. The brain has detected a familiar pattern and responded exactly as it was designed to do. This process explains why attraction often repeats itself across different relationships. People may change faces, places, and circumstances, yet the emotional dynamic feels strangely familiar. The brain seeks coherence, not surprise. It is drawn to emotional environments it already understands, even when those environments are imperfect. What feels like coincidence is often repetition wearing a different mask. The illusion of chance protects the mind from recognizing how deeply patterned love can be. Neurochemistry reinforces this illusion by amplifying significance. When dopamine activates, it heightens focus and motivation, making the encounter feel rare and important. Memory becomes selective, highlighting moments that support the feeling of meaning while minimizing contradictory details. This chemical reinforcement strengthens the narrative of coincidence because the experience feels too intense to be ordinary. The brain equates intensity with importance, even when the underlying process is familiar. Understanding the illusion of chance does not remove beauty from love, it removes confusion. When the brain recognizes that connection follows structure rather than randomness, urgency softens. There is less pressure to chase meaning or interpret signs. Love becomes something that unfolds rather than strikes. The nervous system relaxes when it no longer believes everything is happening by accident. As you listen to this, there is nothing you need to analyze or remember. The information is meant to drift, not settle sharply. Just as the brain quietly forms connections without effort, your thoughts can now slow and loosen. The illusion fades, and what remains is a sense of calm continuity, the feeling that nothing important is rushing toward you and nothing meaningful is being missed. As the illusion of chance deepens, the brain begins to blur the boundary between randomness and meaning. Humans are not comfortable with neutral explanations when emotions are strong, so the mind instinctively searches for significance. When attraction appears unexpectedly, consciousness interprets it as special, rare, or destined, because intensity demands a narrative. The brain, however, does not operate on stories. It operates on probability shaped by experience. What feels like a miraculous meeting is often the natural outcome of countless invisible preferences aligning at the same moment. The brain constantly filters the world, ignoring most people entirely. Thousands of faces pass through perception every week without leaving a trace. This selective blindness is essential for survival, but it also creates the illusion that attention is spontaneous when it finally locks onto someone. In reality, that attention is the end result of a long elimination process. Only individuals who match specific emotional, behavioral, and biological criteria ever reach awareness. When one finally does, it feels like chance simply because you never noticed how many others were filtered out. Memory plays a quiet but powerful role in sustaining this illusion. The brain does not store events objectively, it edits them. Once attraction forms, past moments are reinterpreted to fit the narrative of coincidence. Small details gain symbolic meaning, timing feels intentional, and ordinary circumstances appear extraordinary in hindsight. This reconstruction of memory strengthens belief in chance, even though it is the brain reshaping the past to support the present emotional state. Cultural stories reinforce this process. From an early age, people are taught to associate love with fate, unexpected encounters, and perfect timing. These ideas provide emotional comfort, but they also train the brain to mislabel recognition as randomness. When the internal process matches the external story, the illusion feels complete. The mind relaxes into the belief that something mysterious has occurred, even as the brain continues to operate through familiar neural mechanisms. At a biological level, this illusion is useful. Believing that love is rare and accidental increases its perceived value. The brain invests more attention, energy, and emotional resources into experiences it believes are unique. This investment strengthens bonding and attachment, making relationships more stable in the short term. Chance, in this sense, is not an error. It is a psychological enhancer that deepens commitment. Yet beneath the illusion, the brain remains consistent. It continues to favor patterns that feel known, emotional environments that match prior attachment styles, and interactions that reduce uncertainty. Even when the story is framed as destiny, the underlying process remains grounded in prediction and repetition. Love feels unpredictable, but it rarely is. It follows pathways laid down long before the moment of meeting. As this understanding settles, there is no need to resist it. Nothing is lost when chance dissolves. Mystery remains, but it becomes softer, less urgent. The brain does not need drama to create connection. It needs coherence. And as coherence replaces coincidence, the mind naturally begins to slow, releasing the need to explain or label experience, allowing thought to drift gently toward rest. As the brain continues to believe in chance, it subtly protects itself from uncertainty. Randomness feels exciting on the surface, but deep down it would be terrifying if love truly had no structure. The mind prefers to imagine fate rather than accept that attachment follows patterns shaped by history and biology. Fate feels meaningful without requiring responsibility. If something is destined, the brain does not need to question why it feels drawn, why it stays, or why it repeats familiar emotional experiences. The illusion of chance acts as a psychological shield, softening the weight of self-awareness. This shield becomes especially important when attraction contradicts logic. People often feel drawn to individuals who do not match their conscious ideals, values, or intentions. When this happens, the idea of coincidence steps in to resolve the conflict. It becomes easier to say, "It just happened," than to recognize deeper emotional conditioning at work. The brain uses chance as a narrative shortcut, allowing attachment to form without forcing the conscious mind to confront uncomfortable patterns or unresolved emotional histories. Emotion strengthens this illusion by narrowing focus. When the brain enters an emotionally charged state, it reduces analytical processing in favor of immersion. Details that contradict the story fade, while supportive cues become amplified. The encounter feels singular, isolated from everything else, as if it exists outside of normal cause and effect. This emotional tunnel vision reinforces the sense that something extraordinary is happening, even when the process itself is deeply familiar at a neural level. Over time, repetition stabilizes the illusion. Each interaction that confirms emotional expectation strengthens belief in coincidence. The brain learns that interpreting love as chance reduces internal friction. It no longer needs to ask difficult questions about attachment style, emotional needs, or vulnerability. The narrative becomes self-sustaining. Love feels easier when it is framed as destiny rather than pattern, even though the pattern continues to operate silently underneath. Neuroscience suggests that the brain resists explanations that threaten emotional coherence. When understanding feels destabilizing, the mind delays it. This is why many people resist the idea that attraction is structured. Structure feels limiting, while chance feels expansive. Yet paradoxically, it is structure that allows the nervous system to relax. Predictability reduces anxiety even when it remains unconscious. The illusion persists because it feels emotionally safer than clarity. As awareness slowly grows, the illusion does not shatter suddenly. It fades gradually, like a story losing urgency. The brain does not abandon its narratives abruptly. It replaces them when a calmer explanation becomes available. Understanding does not remove emotion, it softens it. Love becomes less overwhelming, less urgent, less tied to interpretation. The nervous system begins to rest when it no longer believes everything is happening by accident. Listening to this now, there is nothing you need to resolve. The brain absorbs structure quietly, without effort. Thoughts loosen, meaning slows, and the need to label experience fades. Chance becomes less important. What remains is continuity, the sense that connection follows rhythm, not surprise. And rhythm, once recognized, gently guides the mind towards stillness and sleep. As the illusion of chance slowly dissolves, the brain begins to release the tension created by unpredictability. What once felt dramatic starts to feel understandable, and understanding brings calm rather than disappointment. The mind does not lose wonder when it recognizes structure, it gains stability. Love no longer feels like something that happened to you by accident, but something that emerged naturally from who you are, what you have lived, and how your brain learned to connect. This realization does not weaken emotion, it grounds it. When chance loses its grip, urgency softens. There is less pressure to interpret every moment, every message, every silence as a sign. The brain no longer scans constantly for meaning because meaning has already been established. Connection becomes something that unfolds over time rather than something that must be decoded. This shift allows the nervous system to relax, moving away from vigilance and toward regulation. Love becomes quieter, but also deeper. The brain responds to this quiet by conserving energy. Attention broadens again, perception stabilizes, and emotional swings lessen in intensity. Without the drama of coincidence, the mind no longer needs to stay alert. It can settle. The body follows, releasing tension stored in muscles and breath. This is not loss of passion. It is the transformation of excitement into presence. Love stops demanding and starts supporting. In this state, attachment feels less fragile. The fear of disappearance fades because the bond no longer depends on constant stimulation. The brain trusts the pattern it has recognized. Trust reduces cortisol, allowing rest to replace anticipation. Love becomes something you carry lightly rather than something you hold tightly, and what is carried lightly does not exhaust the mind. This is why understanding love as structured rather than random can feel unexpectedly soothing. The brain thrives on coherence. When it no longer believes connection is accidental, it no longer fears losing it without explanation. Even endings, when they happen, make more sense. They are no longer betrayals of fate, but shifts in alignment. Meaning remains, even when form changes. As you absorb this, there is no need to analyze or remember. The information is designed to slow thought, not sharpen it. Just as the illusion of chance fades gently, your own awareness can soften. Nothing important is missing. Nothing needs to be solved. The brain is simply returning to a natural rhythm. And in that rhythm, love becomes less about surprise and more about balance, less about coincidence and more about continuity. The mind rests when it understands that connection follows patterns, not chaos. And rest, once allowed, leads naturally towards stillness, quiet, and sleep. Some people feel familiar not because you have met them before, but because your brain has experienced their emotional pattern many times in different forms. Familiarity is not recognition of a face, it is recognition of a rhythm. The brain does not remember people as images alone, but as combinations of tone, emotional timing, responsiveness, and presence. When someone enters your life whose emotional rhythm aligns closely with patterns already stored in memory, the nervous system responds immediately. There is no need for analysis, comparison, or conscious evaluation. The brain simply relaxes into recognition, producing a sense of ease that feels natural, safe, and strangely intimate, even in the absence of shared history. This familiarity is built early and reinforced repeatedly. From childhood onward, the brain learns what closeness feels like through caregivers, friends, and early attachments. The way attention was given, the way emotions were mirrored, the way safety or unpredictability was experienced, all of this becomes encoded as relational memory. These memories are not stored as stories, but as expectations. When someone later matches those expectations, the brain reacts with a subtle sense of knowing. This is why familiarity can feel immediate and deep, even when logic insists there is no reason for it. The brain is responding to alignment, not information. Instant familiarity often bypasses attraction and goes straight to comfort. The body may relax before the mind understands why. Breathing slows slightly, muscle tension eases, and attention settles without effort. This physiological response is not coincidence. It reflects the brain's assessment that this emotional environment is predictable enough to be safe. Safety, at a neural level, is deeply attractive. The brain prefers environments where it does not need to stay alert. Familiar people reduce cognitive load, allowing the nervous system to move closer to rest rather than vigilance. Because this process happens below awareness, it is often misinterpreted as destiny or intuition. The mind searches for a dramatic explanation to match the emotional weight of the experience, yet the truth is quieter. The brain has encountered a pattern it understands, and understanding feels good. It feels grounding. Familiarity gives the illusion of depth because it removes resistance. Conversation flows, silence feels comfortable, and emotional signals are easily decoded. None of this requires effort because the brain already knows how to respond. This explains why familiarity is not always healthy. The brain can recognize patterns that were once associated with instability or emotional inconsistency and still label them as familiar. Familiar does not mean optimal, it means known. The nervous system sometimes chooses predictability over well-being, especially if unpredictability was normalized early in life. This is why certain connections feel instantly compelling, even when they later prove challenging. The brain mistakes recognition for suitability, comfort for compatibility. As awareness grows, familiarity loses some of its urgency. The brain begins to differentiate between what feels known and what feels supportive. This differentiation takes time and calm attention. When it happens, familiarity becomes less overwhelming and more informative. It turns from a force that pulls automatically into a signal that can be observed, and observation slows the system. When the brain is no longer rushing to interpret familiarity as fate, it can rest inside the experience without pressure. Listening now, there is no need to decide whether familiarity is good or bad. The purpose is simply to notice how the brain responds to recognition. Understanding does not require action, it only requires space. And space allows the nervous system to soften, thoughts to lengthen, and awareness to drift. Familiarity, once understood, no longer demands attention. It becomes part of the background, quiet, steady, and eventually gentle enough to fade into sleep. Instant familiarity often feels like recognition without memory, as if the body knows something the mind cannot explain. This sensation does not arise from thought, comparison, or conscious judgment, but from deep neural associations formed long before awareness becomes involved. The brain stores emotional experiences as patterns of response rather than as narratives, and when someone enters your life whose presence activates these stored patterns, familiarity emerges immediately. It can feel like warmth, calm, or an unspoken understanding that requires no words. The brain does not announce this process. It simply relaxes into it, creating the impression that something meaningful has occurred without effort or intention. These patterns are shaped by repetition over time. Every relationship leaves behind a residue of expectation, teaching the brain what connection feels like at a bodily level. The timing of attention, the balance between closeness and distance, the predictability of emotional responses, all of these elements form an internal map. When someone fits that map closely enough, the brain responds with ease. This ease is powerful because it reduces uncertainty. The nervous system prefers environments where it does not need to prepare for sudden change, and familiarity signals that preparation can soften. The body listens to this signal before the mind has language for it. Because familiarity operates below consciousness, it can feel deeply convincing. The absence of effort is interpreted as proof of significance. Conversations feel natural. Silence feels safe, and emotional responses seem aligned without negotiation. The brain interprets this smoothness as compatibility, even though compatibility and familiarity are not the same. Familiarity reflects recognition, not evaluation. The brain recognizes what it has seen before, not necessarily what will support long-term balance. This distinction is subtle and often overlooked, which is why familiarity can feel so powerful and so difficult to resist. In many cases, familiarity is tied to early attachment experiences. The brain learns its first lessons about connection in environments where safety, attention, and emotion are first encountered. These lessons are not conceptual, they are physiological. Heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, and emotional regulation all adapt to early relational patterns. When a new person activates a similar physiological response later in life, the body responds as if returning to something known. This return can feel comforting, grounding, and emotionally charged, even if the original environment was complex or inconsistent. The intensity of instant familiarity often increases when emotional ambiguity is present. Uncertainty keeps attention engaged, while recognition keeps the nervous system invested. Together, they create a powerful pull. The brain oscillates between knowing and not knowing, which sustains focus and emotional energy. This oscillation can be mistaken for depth or destiny, when it is actually the brain maintaining engagement through partial predictability. Familiarity does not always bring peace. Sometimes it brings activation disguised as connection. As awareness develops, the experience of familiarity begins to change. The brain slowly learns to observe its own reactions rather than being guided by them automatically. Familiarity becomes a signal rather than a command. It can be noticed, felt, and understood without immediate action. This shift reduces urgency. The nervous system no longer needs to rush toward what feels known. It can pause, breathe, and allow space between sensation and response. Space transforms familiarity from attraction into information. Listening to this now, there is no expectation to decide or resolve anything. The brain absorbs understanding gradually, without force. Thoughts may drift, attention may soften, and the body may begin to release tension. Familiarity loses its sharpness when it is understood, becoming a quiet background sensation rather than a driving force. And as that force fades, the mind naturally slows, allowing awareness to settle gently, comfortably, and without resistance into rest. Instant familiarity can feel like a quiet certainty forming before thought has time to intervene, as if the body recognizes a presence before the mind begins to ask questions. This sensation emerges from neural systems designed to evaluate relational environments quickly and efficiently. The brain does not wait for evidence when it senses alignment. It responds to subtle cues such as pacing of speech, emotional responsiveness, and the way attention is offered or withheld. These cues are processed unconsciously, compared against deeply ingrained relational templates, and translated into a feeling that simply says, "This feels known." The absence of friction becomes the message, and the message feels powerful because it arrives without effort. The brain's preference for familiarity is rooted in energy conservation. Novelty requires attention, evaluation, and adaptation, all of which consume cognitive resources. Familiar patterns, on the other hand, allow the brain to operate with minimal effort. When someone feels instantly familiar, the nervous system relaxes because it predicts fewer surprises. This relaxation is subtle but profound. Muscles soften slightly, breathing becomes more regular, and emotional defenses lower without conscious permission. The brain interprets this physiological ease as safety, and safety is one of the strongest foundations for connection. This process often unfolds before attraction is even recognized. Familiarity can exist without desire, without excitement, and without conscious interest. It is a background sensation, a gentle alignment rather than a spark. Over time, this alignment can evolve into attachment if reinforced by repeated interaction. The brain does not rush this evolution. It simply notes that this emotional environment feels manageable, predictable, and coherent. Familiarity becomes the soil in which deeper connection may grow, not because it is dramatic, but because it is stable. However, familiarity can be deceptive. The brain does not distinguish between patterns learned in healthy environments and those learned in unstable or emotionally inconsistent ones. It recognizes repetition, not quality. This is why people sometimes feel drawn to emotional dynamics that recreate earlier experiences, even when those experiences were painful. The nervous system responds to what it knows how to navigate. Familiar stress can feel safer than unfamiliar calm because it is predictable. The brain chooses navigability over comfort and recognition over novelty. As familiarity intensifies, it can create the illusion of depth. Shared silence feels meaningful. Small gestures feel loaded with significance, and emotional resonance feels immediate. These experiences are real, but their interpretation may be amplified by the brain's tendency to equate ease with importance. The mind constructs meaning around the sensation, often attributing it to destiny, intuition, or connection at a soul level. These explanations match the emotional weight of familiarity, even though the underlying process remains grounded in neural efficiency and memory. With awareness, the brain gains the ability to observe familiarity rather than be guided by it automatically. This observation does not eliminate the sensation, it contextualizes it. Familiarity becomes a signal rather than a directive. The nervous system no longer needs to follow the pull immediately. It can pause, assess, and allow space for additional information to emerge. This pause changes the experience of connection, transforming urgency into curiosity and compulsion into choice. As you listen now, there is nothing to analyze or resolve. The brain absorbs structure quietly, allowing understanding to replace intensity. Familiarity softens when it is seen clearly. It becomes less commanding, less insistent, and more neutral. In that neutrality, the mind finds room to slow down. Thoughts stretch, attention loosens, and awareness drifts gently away from effort. Familiarity fades into the background, no longer demanding interpretation, allowing the nervous system to settle into a calm, unguarded state that naturally invites rest and sleep. As familiarity settles fully into awareness, it begins to lose its urgency and transform into quiet presence. What once felt like an immediate pull becomes a steady background signal, no longer demanding interpretation or action. The brain adjusts to the pattern it has recognized, integrating it into its internal landscape without effort. Familiarity stops standing out because it has been accepted. This acceptance is deeply calming, allowing attention to soften and emotional intensity to diffuse into something more stable and less consuming. At this stage, the brain no longer needs to constantly evaluate the connection. Prediction replaces monitoring. The nervous system assumes continuity rather than scanning for change. This assumption reduces mental noise, freeing cognitive resources that were once occupied by anticipation. The body responds in subtle ways, posture relaxes, facial muscles soften, and breathing deepens. Familiarity becomes embodied, no longer a thought or feeling, but a state the body knows how to inhabit without effort. This embodied familiarity often brings a sense of emotional neutrality that is mistaken for boredom. In reality, it is regulation. The nervous system has found a rhythm it can sustain. There is no need for heightened alertness, no need for constant stimulation. Emotional signals arrive gently and leave without leaving sharp traces. Love, at this point, no longer activates urgency. It supports rest. The brain recognizes that it does not need to protect or pursue the connection aggressively. With this regulation comes clarity. Familiarity can now be observed without distortion. The brain differentiates between comfort that supports growth and comfort that maintains repetition. This differentiation is quiet and gradual. It does not require decision or confrontation. It simply allows awareness to widen. The connection remains present, but it no longer dominates perception. Space returns to the mind, and within that space, perspective forms naturally. This shift explains why some connections deepen into long-term bonds while others gently dissolve. When familiarity aligns with emotional stability and mutual regulation, the brain maintains it effortlessly. When it does not, the nervous system slowly disengages, not through drama, but through loss of activation. Interest fades not because something is wrong, but because alignment no longer sustains attention. Familiarity completes its role and steps back. As understanding integrates, the mind no longer clings to the sensation of knowing. There is nothing to chase, nothing to interpret, nothing to preserve. Familiarity becomes a memory of ease rather than a force in the present. The brain stores it, learns from it, and moves on when necessary without resistance. This ability to release is not loss, it is efficiency. The nervous system returns to balance. Listening now, your own brain mirrors this process. Meaning softens, urgency fades, and effort dissolves. There is no need to stay alert or engaged. Familiarity no longer pulls attention forward. It allows awareness to drift inward, slowing thought, loosening perception, and settling gently into stillness. And in that stillness, rest arrives naturally, without being summoned, without being chased, simply because the brain has nothing left to resolve. Desire begins long before conscious wanting appears, rising quietly from the brain's reward system as a signal of motivation rather than pleasure. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the chemical of happiness, but in reality, it is the chemical of pursuit. It does not make you feel good, it makes you want. When dopamine activates, the brain is not celebrating the present moment, it is orienting itself toward a future possibility. This subtle shift changes attention, narrowing focus and pulling thought repeatedly toward the same person, the same idea, the same imagined outcome. Desire feels compelling because dopamine reorganizes priority, not because the object itself is inherently extraordinary. The release of dopamine is deeply tied to uncertainty. The brain responds most strongly when outcomes are unpredictable but potentially rewarding. Clear availability produces calm, but partial availability produces desire. When the brain cannot fully predict emotional response, attention intensifies. Each interaction becomes meaningful not because it is deep, but because it carries possibility. Dopamine thrives in this space between knowing and not knowing, sustaining motivation by keeping the future unresolved. Desire grows not from satisfaction, but from anticipation that has not yet been fulfilled. As dopamine shapes perception, it subtly distorts time. Waiting feels longer, absence feels heavier, and small signals carry exaggerated emotional weight. The brain becomes attuned to cues related to the desired person, filtering out unrelated stimuli. This selective attention creates the feeling of obsession, even when the underlying mechanism is simply neural efficiency. The brain is conserving energy by focusing on what it believes may yield reward. Desire feels intense because the brain has reduced the world to a single focal point. This chemical focus does not require emotional depth to function. Dopamine can activate in response to novelty, challenge, or emotional ambiguity just as easily as it does in response to genuine connection. The brain does not distinguish between meaningful reward and anticipated reward. It responds to potential. This is why desire can feel powerful even in the absence of compatibility or stability. The chemistry is real, but its interpretation may be misleading. desire is not evidence of alignment, it is evidence of activation. Over time, repeated dopamine activation strengthens neural loops. Thought returns to the same imagined scenarios again and again, reinforcing anticipation. Each mental rehearsal releases small amounts of dopamine, sustaining desire even in the absence of new information. The brain becomes self-stimulating, maintaining interest through imagination alone. This loop can feel consuming because it does not require external input to continue. Desire feeds itself as long as uncertainty remains. When desire is not balanced by safety or emotional regulation, the nervous system remains slightly elevated. Cortisol may rise, sleep may become lighter, and attention may struggle to disengage. The brain stays oriented toward the future, waiting for resolution. This state can feel exciting, but it is not restful. Desire, driven by dopamine alone, keeps the system active rather than settled. It energizes, but it does not soothe. As you listen now, there is no need to judge desire or push it away. Understanding its chemistry allows it to soften naturally. When the brain recognizes that desire is a signal rather than a truth, urgency begins to fade. Attention loosens its grip, anticipation quiets, and the nervous system slowly shifts out of pursuit mode. Thought slows when there is nothing left to chase. And in that slowing, dopamine recedes, making space for calm, balance, and the gentle descent into rest. As dopamine continues to shape desire, it slowly teaches the brain what to seek and what to ignore. This teaching does not happen through logic or reflection, but through repetition and reinforcement. Each time attention returns to the same person, the same memory, or the same imagined future, dopamine strengthens the neural pathway that led there. The brain learns efficiency by narrowing its focus, reducing complexity, and prioritizing what it believes will resolve uncertainty. Desire deepens not because the connection grows, but because the pathway becomes easier to travel. Wanting feels natural because the brain has practiced it. This practice alters emotional perception. Small gestures begin to feel disproportionately meaningful, while long periods of absence can feel heavy and unresolved. The brain interprets incomplete information as unfinished business, keeping desire active to motivate closure. Dopamine does not want answers, it wants pursuit. The moment something feels complete, dopamine quiets. Until then, it keeps the system alert, engaged, and slightly restless. Desire feels alive because the brain remains oriented toward what is missing rather than what is present. Over time, this orientation can blur emotional boundaries. The brain begins to associate relief with potential rather than reality. Imagined futures may feel more rewarding than actual interactions, because imagination maintains uncertainty while reality introduces limits. Dopamine thrives in possibility, not fulfillment. This is why desire can intensify even when connection remains shallow or inconsistent. The chemistry does not evaluate depth, it evaluates anticipation. The brain stays engaged as long as the outcome remains unresolved. This mechanism explains why desire can resemble addiction. The brain becomes accustomed to repeated dopamine spikes, each one reinforcing the cycle of wanting. Absence or withdrawal does not bring calm, it increases focus. The nervous system reacts by heightening attention, scanning for cues, and replaying memories. Sleep may become lighter, thoughts more repetitive, and emotional regulation more fragile. Desire keeps the brain active because it signals that something important is still incomplete. When desire dominates without balance, the brain struggles to disengage. Rest becomes difficult because the reward system remains active even in silence. Thoughts drift back toward anticipation, replaying moments or imagining resolution. This is not weakness or lack of control. It is chemistry functioning as designed. The brain is doing its job too well, prioritizing pursuit over rest. Desire energizes, but it does not stabilize. Balance begins when the brain recognizes the difference between motivation and meaning. Desire is not a command, it is a signal. When awareness grows, dopamine loses some of its authority. Attention widens, and the nervous system no longer needs to focus exclusively on one outcome. This widening reduces internal pressure. The brain begins to release its grip, allowing other systems associated with calm and regulation to emerge. Listening now, the brain does not need to solve desire, it only needs to notice it. Awareness changes chemistry quietly, without effort. As understanding replaces urgency, anticipation softens. The body releases tension, breathing deepens, and thought slows. Dopamine recedes when there is nothing left to chase. And in that absence of pursuit, the mind naturally drifts towards stillness, allowing rest to arrive without resistance. When dopamine dominates the emotional system, it quietly changes the way the brain assigns value. What matters is no longer what is stable, supportive, or nourishing, but what keeps the reward circuit active. The brain begins to confuse intensity with importance, mistaking emotional activation for meaning. Desire grows strongest, not around what is consistently present, but around what is partially available, unpredictable, or just out of reach. This is not a flaw in character or judgment. It is the reward system operating exactly as it evolved to do, prioritizing pursuit over peace, motion over rest, and possibility over resolution. This shift in value alters perception in subtle but powerful ways. The brain begins to amplify moments of connection while minimizing moments of absence or inconsistency. Small signs of attention feel disproportionately rewarding, while long gaps are reframed as anticipation rather than absence. Dopamine reshapes memory by highlighting what sustains desire and blurring what threatens it. Red flags do not disappear, they simply lose emotional weight. The brain is not ignoring reality, it is filtering it to protect the continuation of pursuit. Desire persists because the brain has decided that wanting itself is the reward. As this pattern strengthens, emotional attachment can form without emotional safety. The nervous system remains in a state of mild activation, never fully settling, never fully relaxing. Cortisol may fluctuate alongside dopamine, creating a cycle of excitement followed by unease. Sleep becomes lighter, thoughts become repetitive, and emotional regulation becomes more fragile. The brain stays oriented toward resolution that never fully arrives, because resolution would quiet the reward system. Desire survives by remaining unfinished. This is why dopamine-driven desire can attach to people who are emotionally unavailable or inconsistent. Unpredictability keeps the system active. The brain does not experience unpredictability as danger in this context. It experiences it as potential. Each moment of uncertainty promises a possible reward, and dopamine responds to promise more strongly than to fulfillment. Stability quiets desire, but unpredictability feeds it. The chemistry does not distinguish between healthy and unhealthy patterns. It responds to stimulation. Over time, the brain begins to associate emotional relief with imagined outcomes rather than real experiences. Fantasy becomes more regulating than reality because imagination allows the brain to maintain uncertainty without confronting limitation. The desired person becomes a symbol rather than a presence, a projection rather than a relationship. Desire intensifies because it no longer depends on interaction. It sustains itself internally. The brain rehearses future scenarios, releasing dopamine with each imagined resolution that never quite completes. This internal loop can feel deeply personal and emotionally convincing. The mind searches for explanations that match the intensity, often framing the experience as unique, fated, or profound. Yet the depth felt is not always relational, it is neurological. The brain has learned to stay engaged by circling the same unresolved emotional space. Desire feels powerful because it occupies attention continuously, not because it leads toward balance or fulfillment. As awareness gently enters this system, the chemistry begins to shift. The brain does not shut desire down abruptly. It loosens its grip slowly. When attention widens beyond a single focal point, dopamine loses dominance. The nervous system senses that it no longer needs to pursue resolution. Thought slows when it stops chasing imagined futures. The body responds by releasing tension, allowing breath to deepen and muscles to soften. Desire fades not through force, but through understanding. And in that understanding, the brain finally finds permission to rest because there is nothing left it believes it must reach. As dopamine gradually loosens its hold, the brain begins to return to a more balanced internal rhythm. The urgency that once pushed attention forward starts to dissolve, not because desire has disappeared, but because the system no longer believes pursuit is necessary. When the brain realizes that nothing essential is missing, dopamine activity naturally declines. This shift is subtle and quiet. There is no dramatic release, no sudden clarity, only a slow reduction in mental pressure. Thought no longer circles the same imagined outcomes, and attention gently widens, allowing the nervous system to breathe again. In this calmer state, the brain reassesses value. What once felt intensely important begins to feel simply present, no longer demanding constant focus. Desire transforms from a driving force into a background sensation, noticeable but not commanding. The reward system steps back, allowing other neural networks associated with regulation, safety, and rest to come forward. This transition does not feel like loss, it feels like relief. The mind stops asking what comes next and begins to rest inside what already is. The body responds quickly to this internal change. Muscle tension releases in small increments, often without awareness. Breathing becomes deeper and more regular. The heart rate slows as the nervous system shifts out of anticipation and into regulation. Dopamine-driven desire kept the system slightly elevated, always preparing for the future. Now, the future loosens its grip and the present becomes sufficient. This sufficiency is deeply soothing to the brain, which is always searching for signals that it can finally stop scanning. Memory also changes under this softer chemistry. Moments once replayed repeatedly lose their emotional charge. They become memories rather than prompts. The brain no longer uses them to generate motivation. It stores them and moves on. This is not forgetting. It is integration. Experiences are placed where they belong, no longer intruding into awareness. Thought slows because there is nothing left it needs to rehearse. When dopamine quiets, sleep becomes easier. The brain no longer waits for resolution before allowing rest. There is no unfinished business demanding attention. The mind does not need to stay alert in case something happens. This is why deep rest often arrives not after fulfillment, but after release. Desire kept the system awake by pointing forward. Understanding allows the system to turn inward. At this point, desire no longer defines the connection. If attachment remains, it is supported by other systems: trust, familiarity, and emotional regulation. If attachment fades, it does so gently, without withdrawal or urgency. The brain no longer clings because it no longer needs to pursue. Value becomes quieter, steadier, less dramatic. Love, when present, feels calm rather than compelling. Listening now, your own brain mirrors this descent. Thought lengthens, effort dissolves, and attention loosens its grip. There is nothing to chase, nothing to resolve, nothing to anticipate. Dopamine has done its work and stepped aside. What remains is balance. And balance allows the mind to drift naturally, effortlessly, into stillness where sleep does not need to be invited because it is already waiting. For centuries, humans have spoken about love as if it were decided by the heart, as if emotion itself were an independent force capable of choosing, guiding, and committing without influence from the mind. The language of love is filled with metaphors that place decision-making somewhere in the chest, far from thought and reason. Yet the heart does not decide anything. It reacts. It accelerates, slows, tightens, and softens in response to signals sent from the brain. What we interpret as the heart choosing is actually the body responding to neural instructions that were formed long before awareness arrives. The mind decides quietly, and the heart follows faithfully. The brain is the only organ capable of interpretation, prediction, and meaning-making. It receives sensory information, evaluates emotional relevance, and determines what matters enough to influence behavior. When love begins to form, the brain assesses not just attraction, but implication. It asks whether this person feels safe, whether their presence reduces or increases internal tension, and whether their emotional signals align with stored expectations. These assessments happen beneath consciousness, yet they shape every sensation that later feels emotional. The heart responds to this process by changing rhythm, creating the physical sensations we associate with feeling. This is why emotions often feel involuntary. The brain does not consult logic when generating emotional response. It consults pattern. Once a pattern is recognized as significant, the body reacts automatically. The chest tightens or warms, breathing shifts, and awareness narrows. These sensations are not decisions, they are outcomes. When people say their heart chose, what they are describing is the moment bodily sensation reached awareness. The choice itself was already made at a neural level, quietly and efficiently. Over time, this misunderstanding creates conflict. People attempt to reason against what they feel, believing the heart and mind are in opposition. In reality, there is no conflict between heart and mind, only between conscious thought and unconscious decision-making. The brain has already prioritized the connection, while conscious reasoning arrives later, trying to catch up. This delay creates the illusion of contradiction. The mind did decide, Awareness just wasn't informed yet. Neuroscience shows that emotional decision-making relies heavily on memory and prediction rather than logic. The brain evaluates how a connection might feel based on past emotional outcomes, not present facts alone. If a situation resembles something that once brought closeness, relief, or validation, the brain may favor it, even if logic suggests caution. The heart responds to this preference by signaling intensity. Emotion feels persuasive because it is rooted in survival systems designed to guide behavior quickly, not rationally. This process does not mean emotion is unreliable. It means emotion is fast. It operates in a different time frame than conscious thought. The heart does not lie, it reports. It reports what the brain has already determined matters. Confusion arises when people treat emotional signals as instructions rather than information. Feeling drawn does not mean acting is required. Feeling intensity does not mean commitment is necessary. The signal exists whether or not it is followed. As understanding deepens, the question itself begins to soften. The heart does not decide, and the mind does not argue. The brain coordinates. It integrates sensation, memory, chemistry, and expectation into a response that feels unified, even when awareness experiences it as fragmented. When this coordination is recognized, urgency fades. There is no longer a need to choose between feeling and thinking. Both are expressions of the same underlying process. Listening now, there is nothing to resolve. The mind does not need to override the heart, and the heart does not need to convince the mind. Awareness can simply rest in understanding. Emotional signals can arise without demanding action. Thought can slow without resistance. And as the question loses its urgency, the nervous system settles. When nothing inside is arguing, the body naturally relaxes. Breathing deepens, attention loosens, and the mind drifts gently towards stillness, where decisions are no longer needed, and rest becomes effortless. When the brain makes decisions about connection, it does so without language, without emotion as we consciously understand it, and without any sense of narrative. These decisions are formed in silence, through the comparison of countless internal signals that never reach awareness. The brain evaluates how a person affects internal balance, how their presence shifts emotional regulation, and how predictable their behavior feels at a nervous system level. This evaluation happens continuously and automatically, long before the question of choice ever appears in consciousness. What later feels like a sudden emotional decision is actually the final surface expression of a process that has been unfolding quietly for a long time. The heart enters this process only as a messenger. It reflects what the brain has already prioritized by altering rhythm, pressure, and sensation in the body. A racing heart, a warmth in the chest, or a sudden heaviness are not choices. They are physical translations of neural decisions. The body does not debate or analyze. It responds. This response feels powerful because it bypasses thought entirely, arriving as sensation rather than idea. Sensation feels convincing because it is immediate and embodied, even though it carries no instruction on what to do next. This is where confusion often begins. People interpret bodily signals as commands rather than information. When the heart reacts strongly, the mind assumes a decision has been made. In reality, the brain has only indicated relevance. Relevance does not equal commitment. It simply means attention has been assigned. The brain flags something as important so that it can be explored, not necessarily acted upon. The heart amplifies this signal, making it difficult to ignore, but amplification does not imply correctness or permanence. Over time, repeated bodily responses reinforce belief. When the same sensations appear again and again in the presence of a particular person, the mind begins to construct meaning around them. Stories form to explain why the heart reacts, often using language of destiny, intuition, or inevitability. These stories feel true because they match the intensity of sensation. Yet intensity is not evidence of alignment, it is evidence of activation. The brain can activate strongly around uncertainty, familiarity, or unresolved emotional patterns just as easily as it can around genuine compatibility. Neuroscience reveals that many decisions attributed to emotion are actually rooted in avoidance of discomfort. The brain prefers states that reduce internal tension, even if those states are not objectively beneficial. If a connection promises relief from loneliness, distraction from uncertainty, or validation of identity, the brain may prioritize it regardless of long-term outcome. The heart responds to this prioritization with intensity, reinforcing the illusion that the decision is emotional rather than strategic. The strategy, however, is not conscious. It is biological. As awareness grows, the distinction between signal and instruction becomes clearer. The heart can react without demanding action. Sensation can exist without interpretation. The brain begins to observe its own processes rather than being driven by them automatically. This observation creates space. Space weakens urgency. When urgency fades, the nervous system no longer feels compelled to resolve or pursue. The body remains calm even in the presence of strong sensation. Listening now, there is no need to decide whether the heart or the mind is in control. Control is not the point. Integration is. The brain coordinates sensation, memory, and prediction into experience, and awareness receives that experience without obligation. When nothing inside needs to be chosen or proven, tension dissolves naturally. Thought slows because it has no task. The heart settles because it has delivered its message. And in that quiet coordination, the system finally rests, allowing the mind to drift gently, effortlessly, into stillness and sleep. When people say they acted against their better judgment, what they often mean is that they acted in alignment with an older, deeper system that does not operate on logic or conscious intention. The brain carries layers of decision-making, and the most powerful ones are not the newest or the most rational, but the most practiced. These layers were shaped through repetition, emotional exposure, and survival needs long before conscious reasoning became dominant. When a situation activates these older systems, the brain responds quickly and decisively, often before the rational mind has time to evaluate consequences. The heart reacts because the decision has already been set in motion, not because it initiated the choice. These deep systems are not concerned with what is ideal, they are concerned with what is familiar. Familiarity reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty demands energy. The brain conserves energy by returning to patterns it already understands, even if those patterns once caused discomfort or pain. When a connection resembles something known, the nervous system relaxes slightly, interpreting predictability as safety. This relaxation feels like attraction, relief, or emotional pull. The heart responds with intensity because intensity keeps attention focused. ensuring the pattern can be completed or repeated. The brain is not seeking happiness, it is seeking resolution. This is why people can feel strongly drawn to situations they consciously know are misaligned. The rational mind evaluates values, goals, and outcomes, while the emotional system evaluates emotional familiarity and anticipated relief. When these evaluations conflict, sensation usually wins. Sensation is immediate and embodied, while logic is abstract and delayed. The brain prioritizes what it can feel over what it can imagine. The heart amplifies this prioritization, making it difficult to ignore. What feels like choosing with the heart is often the brain returning to a pattern that promises emotional completion. Memory plays a crucial role in sustaining this process. The brain stores emotional experiences not as timelines, but as states. When a current situation recreates a familiar emotional state, the brain responds as if returning to unfinished business. The past is not remembered as something that happened. It is reactivated as something happening again. The heart reacts because the body is reliving a known state, not because the present situation is objectively meaningful. This is why intensity can feel disproportionate to reality. The emotion belongs as much to memory as it does to the present moment. Over time, repeated engagement with these patterns strengthens them. Neural pathways become more efficient, emotional responses become faster, and awareness becomes less involved. The brain learns that following the signal reduces internal tension, at least temporarily. This reinforcement makes future decisions feel even less voluntary. The mind may believe it is choosing freely, but the choice is already weighted by years of emotional conditioning. The heart feels convincing because it is backed by practiced neural circuitry, not because it holds wisdom independent of the brain. Awareness does not eliminate these patterns immediately. It introduces delay. Delay weakens compulsion. When awareness notices sensation without acting on it, the brain experiences something new, regulation without repetition. This experience slowly teaches the nervous system that relief does not require reenactment. The heart can beat strongly without dictating behavior. Emotion can arise without being obeyed. This is not suppression, it is integration. The system learns that it can tolerate intensity without resolving it through action. Listening now, there is nothing you need to correct or overcome. The purpose is simply to let understanding replace urgency. The brain absorbs this quietly, without force. Patterns soften when they are seen clearly. Sensation loses authority when it is no longer mistaken for instruction. Thought slows because it no longer needs to justify or resist emotion. And in this slowing, the nervous system finally releases its grip, allowing the body to rest, the mind to drift, and awareness to settle gently into sleep without conflict or effort. As the question itself begins to dissolve, the brain no longer needs to separate heart from mind in order to make sense of experience. What once felt like an internal conflict slowly reveals itself as a misunderstanding of timing. The heart was never making decisions, and the mind was never ignoring emotion. Both were participating in the same process at different layers of awareness. When this realization settles, tension eases. There is no longer a need to choose sides, no longer a need to justify feeling or suppress thought. The system becomes whole again, operating as it was always meant to, quietly coordinated rather than internally divided. The brain functions as an integrator, not a judge. It gathers sensation, memory, chemistry, and prediction into a unified response that the body expresses through feeling. The heart reflects this integration by responding physically, translating neural activity into rhythm and pressure. What feels like emotional truth is simply the body reporting what the brain has already prioritized. This does not make emotion false or unreliable. It makes it contextual. Emotion becomes information rather than instruction, a signal to be noticed rather than a command to be followed. When people learn to listen without reacting, something subtle but powerful happens. The nervous system experiences safety without action. Sensation can rise and fall without consequence. The brain learns that it does not need to resolve every signal immediately. This learning rewires expectation. Urgency fades. Emotional intensity no longer demands movement. The heart can beat strongly while the body remains still. This ability to remain present without reacting is not control, it is regulation, and regulation is deeply calming. In this regulated state, decision-making becomes slower and more deliberate without effort. The brain no longer rushes toward relief or away from discomfort. It allows time to pass. It allows information to accumulate. What once felt overwhelming now feels manageable. The system no longer confuses intensity with importance or familiarity with truth. Instead, it observes. Observation creates distance, and distance creates choice. The heart continues to respond, but its responses are no longer mistaken for destiny. This shift changes the experience of love itself. Love no longer feels like something that happens to you without consent. It becomes something that unfolds in alignment with awareness. Attraction may still arise, desire may still activate, but neither controls behavior. The brain maintains balance between engagement and rest. Love feels calmer, steadier, less dramatic, and more sustainable. It no longer pulls the nervous system into constant motion. It allows stillness to exist alongside connection. When the heart and mind are no longer imagined as opponents, the body relaxes deeply. There is nothing inside that needs to be argued with or overridden. Emotional signals arrive and depart without friction. Thought slows because it is no longer defending or negotiating. The nervous system settles into a rhythm that supports rest rather than vigilance. This is why understanding feels like relief. It removes internal noise rather than adding explanation. Listening now, there is nothing left to solve. The question has served its purpose and can rest. The heart continues to beat, the mind continues to think, but neither needs to lead. Awareness floats above the process, observing without interference. Breathing deepens, muscles soften, thought stretches and loosens. And as the system finds balance within itself, sleep arrives naturally, not as an escape, but as a continuation of calm, where nothing needs to be decided and nothing needs to be chased. Love did not appear to make humans happy. It appeared to make humans continue. Long before language, culture, or personal meaning existed, the brain evolved systems designed to solve a single problem: survival through connection. Love is not an emotion in its origin. It is an algorithm, a biological sequence of rules that evaluates proximity, attachment, cooperation, and reproduction, optimizing behavior without requiring awareness. What feels deeply personal today began as an impersonal process, refined across millions of years, quietly shaping who bonds with whom and why. The brain does not choose partners randomly because randomness is inefficient. Evolution favors patterns that repeat successful outcomes. When early humans formed bonds that increased survival through shared resources, protection, or caregiving, the brain reinforced those bonding mechanisms chemically and neurologically. Over generations, these mechanisms became embedded as instinct. Love became a shortcut, a fast-track decision system that bypassed slow reasoning and pushed individuals toward behaviors that increased continuity. The feeling came later. The function came first. This algorithm operates through preference rather than logic. The brain evaluates signals that once correlated with survival: familiarity, reliability, emotional attunement, and reproductive viability. These signals are processed unconsciously, filtered through inherited tendencies and learned experience. Attraction feels selective because it is selective. The algorithm narrows the field, reducing complexity by guiding attention toward a small number of potential bonds. Love feels exclusive not because it is mystical, but because exclusivity increases stability, and stability once increased survival. Over time, this evolutionary system adapted to social complexity. As human societies grew more intricate, love expanded beyond reproduction into long-term bonding, cooperation, and shared meaning. The algorithm adjusted, incorporating emotional regulation, trust, and attachment as variables. Love began to reward not just physical survival, but psychological continuity. The brain learned that stable bonds reduced stress, increased resilience, and improved group cohesion. Love became both a survival tool and a regulatory mechanism for the nervous system. Despite modern narratives, this algorithm has not disappeared. It still runs quietly beneath culture, belief, and personal identity. People believe they are choosing freely, yet their preferences often reflect ancient priorities shaped by biology and experience. Familiarity feels safe because safety once meant survival. Emotional attunement feels attractive because misattunement once meant risk. The algorithm does not care about ideals, it cares about outcomes. Love persists because it continues to serve regulation, continuity, and adaptation. This perspective does not strip love of meaning, it reframes it. Meaning emerges not because love is mysterious, but because it is effective. The brain rewards what works. When a bond reduces internal chaos, increases cooperation, or stabilizes emotion, the algorithm reinforces it. Pleasure, attachment, and longing are not random gifts. They are feedback mechanisms. Love feels profound because it aligns individual experience with evolutionary purpose, even when that purpose is no longer conscious. As you listen now, there is no need to resist this idea. Understanding love as an algorithm does not make it mechanical or cold. It makes it precise. The brain relaxes when it recognizes structure. Confusion fades when randomness is replaced by pattern. Thought slows because there is nothing left to decode. Love becomes something that unfolds according to rhythm rather than accident. And rhythm, once recognized, gently guides the nervous system towards stillness, where awareness can rest, unburdened by meaning, drifting naturally into sleep. The evolutionary algorithm behind love does not optimize for comfort or happiness. It optimizes for continuation under uncertainty. This distinction is crucial because it explains why love can sometimes guide people toward experiences that feel confusing, painful, or emotionally destabilizing. Evolution does not remove inefficient pathways if they still produce survival advantages under certain conditions. Instead, It preserves systems that work often enough. Love, as an algorithm, prioritizes bonding intensity over emotional ease because intense bonds were historically more likely to hold groups together during threat, scarcity, and instability. This is why the brain can favor connections that activate stress alongside attraction. In ancestral environments, heightened emotional arousal increased alertness and motivation, keeping individuals invested in relationships that required effort to maintain. Calm was not always safe. Predictable comfort could signal stagnation, while emotional fluctuations signaled engagement. The algorithm learned to associate emotional intensity with importance, even when that intensity included anxiety or longing. What feels emotionally difficult today may once have increased vigilance and commitment in unpredictable environments. The algorithm also does not distinguish between emotional pain and emotional significance. From an evolutionary perspective, pain is informative. It signals risk, loss, and urgency. When a bond triggers fear of loss or inconsistency, the brain interprets this as a high-stakes connection. Dopamine and stress hormones interact, creating a powerful motivational loop. The algorithm does not ask whether the bond feels good. It asks whether it demands attention. Attention was survival. Love evolved to command it. Memory reinforces this process across generations and individual lifetimes. The brain stores not just outcomes, but emotional states associated with survival and attachment. If emotional volatility once coincided with bonding, protection, or belonging, the algorithm may continue to favor similar patterns. This does not mean the brain is broken. It means it is consistent. The algorithm repeats what once mattered, even when context has changed. Modern life no longer requires the same emotional strategies, but the neural machinery remains. This explains why awareness alone does not immediately override attraction. The algorithm operates below conscious intention. Knowing that a pattern is unhelpful does not deactivate it instantly. The brain must experience regulation without loss for the algorithm to update. New data must be gathered. Stability must be proven repeatedly. Until then, the algorithm continues to rely on familiar signals, even if they create discomfort. Evolution moves slowly. It updates through repetition, not insight. Over time, the algorithm can adapt. When the brain experiences secure bonds that do not require emotional struggle to maintain, neural priorities begin to shift. The algorithm learns that safety can coexist with continuity. Stress is no longer required to sustain attachment. This learning happens gradually, through consistent experience rather than conscious decision. Love begins to feel calmer not because desire weakens, but because the algorithm has updated its parameters. Listening now, there is no need to judge the algorithm or fight it. Understanding it creates patience. Patterns are not personal failures. They are inherited strategies awaiting new evidence. The brain softens when it realizes it does not need to rush adaptation. Thought slows because it no longer needs to solve the problem of love. The algorithm continues quietly, recalibrating in the background. And as recalibration replaces urgency, the nervous system settles into a rhythm where nothing needs to be forced, allowing awareness to drift gently toward rest and sleep. Although the evolutionary algorithm of love feels fixed, it is not immutable. It adapts slowly, patiently, and almost invisibly, updating itself through experience rather than intention. The brain does not rewrite its deepest rules because of insight alone. It rewrites them when reality consistently contradicts expectation. When new forms of connection are encountered repeatedly, especially those that offer safety without volatility, the algorithm begins to register alternative outcomes. This process is gradual and often imperceptible, unfolding beneath awareness as the nervous system gathers evidence that survival and stability can coexist. The key to this adaptation lies in regulation. When the brain experiences calm connection without loss, abandonment, or threat, it receives data it did not previously have. Each regulated interaction slightly weakens the old association between intensity and importance. Over time, the algorithm begins to reweight its variables. Familiarity is no longer defined by emotional chaos, but by predictability and emotional availability. Safety becomes rewarding not because it is novel, but because it proves sustainable. The brain learns not through instruction, but through repetition. This learning requires time because the algorithm is cautious. Evolution favors reliability over speed. One calm experience does not override years of emotional conditioning. The brain must witness stability again and again before trusting it. Each repetition strengthens new neural pathways, slowly replacing older ones. The nervous system begins to relax more quickly in response to consistency and less quickly in response to volatility. Attraction shifts subtly, often without conscious awareness, as the algorithm recalibrates what it recognizes as valuable. As this recalibration continues, desire itself begins to change character. The pull toward unpredictability weakens, replaced by a quieter interest in presence and reliability. This does not feel dramatic or intense. It feels subtle, almost neutral at first. Many mistake this neutrality for lack of connection because the algorithm has long equated intensity with meaning. Yet over time, this neutrality reveals itself as peace. The brain no longer needs to stay alert. Attachment no longer requires vigilance. Love becomes a state rather than a pursuit. Memory plays an important role in reinforcing these updates. When regulated connections are stored without accompanying stress, the brain builds a new archive of emotional reference. These memories become templates for future attraction. The algorithm begins to recognize calm as familiar, not boring. Emotional availability becomes legible. The brain stops scanning for emotional extremes and starts valuing continuity. What once felt invisible now feels grounding. This transformation does not erase old patterns completely. The algorithm does not delete history. It integrates it. Old attractions may still arise, but they carry less authority. The brain recognizes them as outdated strategies rather than urgent truths. Awareness increases naturally, without effort. There is less confusion, less inner conflict, because the system is no longer being pulled in opposite directions. Desire aligns more closely with regulation, and regulation supports rest. Listening now, your brain absorbs this possibility without needing to act on it. There is no requirement to change, fix, or choose differently. The algorithm updates quietly, in its own time, responding to experience rather than pressure. Thought slows as urgency fades. The nervous system senses that adaptation does not require force. And in that understanding, the mind settles into a deeper calm where nothing needs to be pursued and nothing needs to be resisted, allowing awareness to drift gently, effortlessly into sleep. As the evolutionary algorithm of love completes its cycle, it no longer feels like a force pushing behavior, but like a background intelligence quietly maintaining balance. The brain does not need to announce this shift. It simply stops insisting. What once demanded attention now feels integrated, settled into the nervous system as a known rhythm rather than an urgent signal. Love, at this stage, is no longer something the brain seeks to resolve or pursue. It becomes a stable configuration, a pattern that exists without effort, allowing awareness to rest rather than engage. This quiet integration is the true endpoint of the algorithm. Evolution does not reward endless pursuit, it rewards efficiency. When a bond no longer requires constant monitoring, emotional energy can be conserved. The brain reduces activity in systems responsible for anticipation and threat detection, allowing regulatory networks to dominate. Stress hormones decrease, emotional volatility smooths out, and the body enters a state of sustained calm. Love stops activating survival responses and starts supporting equilibrium. The algorithm has completed its task. In this state, love feels less like desire and more like presence. There is no need to imagine futures or replay past moments. The brain does not rehearse scenarios because nothing feels unresolved. Attachment becomes quiet continuity rather than emotional intensity. The nervous system no longer needs to signal urgency to maintain connection. What remains is a sense of internal coherence, where thoughts, sensations, and emotions move at the same pace. Love becomes part of the environment rather than the focus of attention. Importantly, this completion does not depend on outcome. The algorithm can settle whether a connection continues or ends. When it ends, it does so without chaos, because the brain has integrated the experience fully. Meaning is preserved without clinging. When it continues, it does so without tension, because nothing needs to be secured. Love no longer asks for proof. The algorithm understands that continuity does not require intensity to exist. This is why mature love often feels quiet and difficult to describe. Language evolved to explain change and urgency, not stability. When nothing inside is pushing or pulling, there is little to narrate. The brain simply maintains the pattern. This maintenance is deeply restful. The nervous system remains regulated, attention broadens, and awareness becomes spacious. Love, in its most evolved form, supports stillness rather than movement. As understanding settles, the mind no longer tries to control or interpret connection. There is no need to analyze signals or anticipate shifts. The algorithm operates efficiently in the background, allowing conscious awareness to disengage. Thought slows because it has no task. Emotion stabilizes because it has no threat. The body responds by releasing residual tension, preparing itself naturally for rest. Listening now, your own brain mirrors this final stage. There is nothing left to pursue, nothing left to decode, nothing left to solve. The algorithm has done its work. Awareness floats above it, free from urgency. Breathing deepens, muscles soften, thought stretches and loosens. And in this state of quiet completion, sleep arrives not as an escape, but as a continuation, the natural resting point of a system that no longer needs to move. Attachment does not form through intensity, desire, or excitement. It forms through repetition that feels safe. Oxytocin is the chemical signature of this safety, released not in moments of pursuit, but in moments of consistency. The brain does not use oxytocin to motivate action. It uses it to allow rest. When oxytocin flows, the nervous system receives a message that vigilance can soften, that nothing needs to be chased, and that connection can exist without effort. Attachment begins when the brain learns that presence does not require protection. Oxytocin is released in subtle ways that often go unnoticed. A calm voice, predictable behavior, emotional availability, and gentle physical closeness all signal safety to the brain. Unlike dopamine, oxytocin does not demand attention. It spreads quietly, lowering stress responses and stabilizing emotional fluctuations. The brain begins to associate the other person with regulation rather than stimulation. This association does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary, and that ordinariness is precisely what allows attachment to deepen over time. Trust emerges not from promises, but from nervous system consistency. When interactions repeatedly confirm that emotional signals will be met rather than ignored or distorted, the brain reduces its need to monitor outcomes. Oxytocin supports this reduction by dampening fear responses and softening threat perception. The brain stops asking what might go wrong and starts assuming continuity. This assumption is not naive, it is learned. Trust forms when the brain has collected enough evidence that regulation is preserved in connection. As attachment strengthens, the body responds by settling more easily into calm states. Heart rate variability improves, breathing deepens, and emotional recovery becomes faster after stress. The presence of the other person begins to function as a regulatory cue. Even in their absence, the brain retains a sense of stability because the attachment has been internalized. Oxytocin does not tie attachment to proximity alone. It allows the brain to carry connection inward, reducing dependency on constant reassurance. This internalization is what distinguishes secure attachment from anxious bonding. In secure attachment, oxytocin supports autonomy as much as closeness. The brain does not panic in absence because the bond does not require constant stimulation to survive. Trust does not collapse under distance or silence. The nervous system remains regulated because it does not equate separation with threat. Attachment becomes a stable background state rather than an active pursuit. Over time, oxytocin reshapes emotional expectation. The brain begins to prefer calm connection over emotional volatility. What once felt exciting may begin to feel disruptive. The algorithm of attachment updates its priorities, valuing consistency and emotional availability more strongly. This shift often feels subtle, almost invisible, yet it profoundly changes relational experience. Love becomes quieter, slower, and more sustainable. The brain no longer seeks activation, it seeks balance. Listening now, your own nervous system responds to this rhythm. There is no urgency, no anticipation, no need to stay alert. Oxytocin supports this softness, allowing awareness to rest without effort. Thought loosens its grip, emotional tone evens out, and the body releases tension it no longer needs to carry. Attachment, when rooted in trust, does not keep the mind awake. It allows the mind to rest. And as rest deepens, sleep arrives naturally, supported by a system that finally feels safe enough to let go. Oxytocin does not simply create connection, it stabilizes it by teaching the brain to associate a specific person with emotional safety. Once this association forms, the nervous system begins to rely on it as a reference point for regulation. Stress decreases more quickly in their presence. Emotional balance returns faster after disruption, and uncertainty feels more manageable when the bond is mentally available. Over time, the brain integrates this regulatory effect so deeply that the connection becomes part of its internal calming system. Attachment is no longer something external, it becomes something the brain uses to maintain equilibrium. This internal reliance is what makes attachment so enduring. The brain prefers known sources of regulation over unknown alternatives, even when circumstances change. When oxytocin has linked calm and safety to a particular person, separation creates a temporary gap in the nervous system's regulatory map. The brain does not interpret this gap as emotional loss alone. It interprets it as physiological instability. This is why detachment can feel disorienting, heavy, or physically uncomfortable. The system is adjusting to the absence of a familiar stabilizer. Oxytocin also alters perception of threat. When attachment is strong, the brain lowers defensive responses around the bonded person. Vulnerability increases, not because risk disappears, but because trust suppresses fear signals. This suppression is adaptive within stable bonds, yet it can persist even when stability fades. The brain continues to expect regulation where it once existed. Letting go becomes difficult, not because the bond is still rewarding, but because the nervous system remembers it as safe. Memory holds on to regulation, longer than logic holds on to meaning. As attachment deepens, oxytocin supports emotional continuity across time. The brain maintains a sense of connection even in absence, using memory and imagination to preserve regulation. This continuity can feel comforting, but it can also slow disengagement when change is needed. The nervous system resists abrupt loss of familiar regulation. It prefers gradual transitions, allowing chemistry to recalibrate slowly. This resistance is not weakness, it is the brain protecting stability while it adapts. This is why detachment often requires more than understanding. Insight alone does not dissolve oxytocin-based bonds. The brain must experience alternative sources of regulation repeatedly before it can release reliance on the old one. Calm must be felt elsewhere. Safety must be proven again. Until then, the attachment remains active, not because the bond is ideal, but because the nervous system has not yet updated its map. Oxytocin does not argue. It waits for evidence. Over time, new experiences begin to soften the bond's intensity. As the brain encounters regulation without the original attachment, oxytocin slowly redistributes. The nervous system learns that stability can exist independently. This learning is gentle and cumulative. There is no sudden release, only gradual loosening. Emotional charge fades as regulation becomes less exclusive. Attachment does not break, it integrates into memory as a completed pattern rather than an active one. Listening now, there is nothing you need to release or force. The brain adapts at its own pace. Oxytocin-based bonds soften naturally when safety is no longer tied to a single source. Awareness of this process allows patience. Thought slows because it does not need to resolve attachment immediately. The nervous system relaxes when it senses that adaptation is possible without loss. And in that relaxation, the body settles, the mind loosens, and rest becomes accessible again, quiet, steady, and unhurried. Trust does not emerge from careful evaluation or conscious decision. It emerges when the brain repeatedly experiences emotional outcomes that feel predictable enough to lower its guard. Oxytocin plays a central role in this process by dampening threat detection and amplifying signals of safety, allowing vulnerability to exist without immediate fear. When trust forms, The brain stops scanning constantly for signs of danger and begins to assume continuity. This assumption is not logical, it is physiological. The nervous system relaxes because it believes it understands the emotional environment, and understanding reduces the need for protection. The problem is that the brain measures trust by consistency, not by intention. If someone behaves in ways that are emotionally familiar, even if those behaviors include inconsistency or withdrawal, the brain may still label them as trustworthy because their pattern is predictable. Predictability lowers uncertainty, and lowered uncertainty feels like safety. This is how trust can form around dynamics that are not actually supportive. The brain does not ask whether a pattern is healthy, it asks whether it is known. Oxytocin reinforces this familiarity by calming the nervous system whenever the pattern repeats, even if the repetition includes discomfort. This mechanism explains why trust can feel so convincing, even when evidence suggests caution. Once oxytocin has reduced fear responses, warning signals lose intensity. Doubt feels muted, and concern feels distant. The brain interprets the absence of fear as proof of safety, even when that absence is chemically induced rather than situationally justified. Trust feels real because it is real at a physiological level, even if it is misplaced at a relational one. The body believes before the mind can question. Memory strengthens this illusion. The brain recalls moments of closeness more vividly than moments of disappointment once trust has formed. Oxytocin biases memory toward regulation, smoothing emotional edges and softening recollection of conflict. Over time, the narrative of the bond becomes more stable than the reality of the interaction. Trust persists not because nothing went wrong, but because the brain edited its memory to preserve emotional continuity. This editing reduces internal conflict, allowing attachment to continue without constant reassessment. As trust deepens, vulnerability increases. The brain lowers defenses and allows emotional exposure, believing that risk is minimal. This vulnerability can be nourishing in safe bonds, but destabilizing in unsafe ones. When vulnerability is not met with care, the nervous system experiences confusion rather than immediate withdrawal. Oxytocin suppresses fear long enough for the brain to search for regulation within the same bond that caused the disturbance. Trust delays disengagement because the system is still seeking restoration where it once found it. Over time, repeated breaches begin to accumulate as physiological stress. The nervous system cannot remain regulated indefinitely in the absence of actual safety. Even when trust feels present, the body starts signaling strain through fatigue, tension, or emotional heaviness. The brain slowly gathers new data, noticing that regulation is no longer sustained. Trust does not vanish suddenly. It erodes gradually as oxytocin's calming effect weakens in the face of repeated dysregulation. Awareness grows quietly, without drama. Listening now. There is no need to judge where trust has been placed. The brain trusted because it was designed to seek safety efficiently, not perfectly. Understanding this brings compassion rather than self-criticism. Trust is not a failure of intelligence, it is a function of regulation. As this understanding settles, the nervous system softens. There is nothing to fix, nothing to defend. Thought slows because it no longer needs to justify or resist attachment. And in this softness, the mind finds space to rest, allowing awareness to drift gently towards sleep. As attachment and trust fully settle into the nervous system, they stop feeling like active processes and begin to function as quiet background states. The brain no longer monitors the bond for confirmation, nor does it search for reassurance. Oxytocin has already done its work, integrating safety into expectation. When trust reaches this stage, it no longer announces itself through emotion or thought. It simply exists as an absence of tension. The mind does not feel compelled to check, interpret, or anticipate. Presence becomes enough. This quiet trust reshapes perception subtly. Interactions lose their sharp emotional edges and become smoother, less charged. The brain stops magnifying small signals because it no longer needs to extract meaning from them. Silence feels neutral rather than threatening. Distance feels manageable rather than alarming. The nervous system has learned that regulation does not depend on constant input. Oxytocin supports this learning by maintaining emotional balance even in the absence of stimulation. Trust becomes internal rather than reactive. At this stage, attachment no longer demands effort. The brain does not cling, pursue, or defend. It assumes continuity without anxiety. This assumption frees cognitive and emotional resources that were once occupied by vigilance. Thought slows because it has fewer tasks. Emotion stabilizes because it has fewer disruptions. The body responds by maintaining calm states more easily, shifting naturally toward rest when activity ends. Attachment becomes a foundation rather than a focus. Importantly, this form of trust does not collapse when circumstances change. If distance increases or connection shifts, the nervous system does not immediately panic. Oxytocin has already established a memory of regulation that can be accessed internally. Loss, if it occurs, is processed gradually rather than catastrophically. The brain understands that safety can be remembered even when it is no longer present. Attachment completes its cycle without fragmentation. This completion is often misunderstood as emotional detachment. In reality, it is emotional integration. The bond has been fully processed by the nervous system and no longer requires activation to remain meaningful. Love does not disappear. It transforms into quiet coherence. The brain stores the experience as a stable reference rather than an unresolved need. Trust becomes something that was lived, not something that must be maintained. As awareness absorbs this, there is nothing left to protect or pursue. The nervous system no longer prepares for threat or loss. Emotional signals arrive softly and pass without disturbance. The body settles into a rhythm that supports long periods of calm without interruption. This is why deep attachment, when complete, supports sleep rather than disrupting it. The brain knows it does not need to stay alert. Listening now, your own system mirrors this resolution. Attachment no longer pulls attention outward. Trust no longer requires confirmation. Thought stretches and loosens, drifting without purpose. Breathing deepens naturally. Muscles soften without instruction. Nothing inside needs to hold on, and nothing needs to let go. The system has reached balance. And in that balance, awareness fades gently into stillness, allowing sleep to arrive as the natural continuation of a mind and body that finally feels safe enough to rest. Love does not fade suddenly, and it does not deepen because of a single moment. Both processes unfold quietly, shaped by the nervous system's ongoing assessment of regulation. The brain is always asking a simple question beneath awareness. Does this connection still help me maintain balance, or does it require increasing effort to sustain? When love fades, it is rarely because emotion disappears. It fades because the brain slowly withdraws energy from a system that no longer supports internal stability. When love deepens, it does so because the nervous system continues to experience coherence, safety, and predictability within the bond. Fading often begins as subtle disengagement rather than conflict. The brain reduces anticipation, thoughts return less frequently, emotional signals arrive with less intensity. This is not avoidance or denial, it is reallocation. The nervous system conserves resources by pulling attention away from connections that no longer regulate effectively. Love fades not through rejection, but through quiet reprioritization. The bond becomes less central because it no longer organizes the internal world. Nothing dramatic needs to happen for this shift to occur. The brain simply stops investing. Deepening follows the opposite path. The brain continues to allocate energy because regulation remains intact. Emotional presence is met consistently, stress is absorbed rather than amplified, and trust does not erode under pressure. Over time, the nervous system learns that it does not need to adapt defensively within the bond. Effort decreases. The connection feels easier to maintain, not because it lacks challenge, but because challenges do not destabilize regulation. Love deepens as it becomes structurally integrated into the nervous system. Memory plays a quiet role in both outcomes. When interactions are stored without unresolved tension, the brain associates the bond with completion rather than anticipation. There is less need to replay moments or imagine alternatives. The past feels settled. In contrast, when interactions leave fragments of emotional disruption, memory remains active, looping unresolved material. Over time, this looping exhausts the system. Love fades not because care is gone, but because the brain seeks relief from unfinished processing. Importantly, fading does not mean failure. From an evolutionary and neurological perspective, disengagement is adaptive. The brain releases bonds that no longer serve regulation in order to remain flexible. This flexibility allows new configurations to form without carrying excessive emotional load. Letting go is not betrayal of love, it is completion of its function. The nervous system closes cycles when they no longer contribute to balance. Fading is often a sign of integration, not loss. Deepening, similarly, is not clinging, it is stabilization. When love deepens, it stops demanding proof or reassurance. The bond does not need constant attention to survive. The brain trusts its continuity. Emotional energy becomes available for other areas of life because attachment no longer consumes it. Love supports expansion rather than narrowing. It becomes a background constant rather than a foreground focus. Listening now, there is no need to decide whether love fades or deepens in your own experience. The brain understands these processes without conscious effort. Awareness can simply rest inside the rhythm. Fading and deepening are not opposites. They are outcomes of the same regulatory intelligence. The nervous system chooses balance over intensity, coherence over urgency. And as this understanding settles, thought slows, attention loosens, and the mind drifts gently towards stillness where nothing needs to continue and nothing needs to end, allowing sleep to arrive naturally. In the same relationship, two nervous systems can experience completely different realities. Love does not fade or deepen in response to shared events alone, but in response to how each brain processes regulation within those events. One person may experience consistency, emotional availability, and safety, while the other experiences effort, uncertainty, or subtle tension. These differences do not require conflict to exist. They emerge quietly, shaped by individual history, attachment patterns, and nervous system sensitivity. Love deepens for the brain that feels regulated, and it fades for the brain that feels it must work harder to remain balanced. Each nervous system carries its own baseline for safety. What feels reassuring to one person may feel neutral or even insufficient to another. When one partner's needs align closely with what the bond provides, regulation strengthens. Oxytocin reinforces trust, stress responses soften, and emotional presence becomes effortless. For the other partner, the same bond may require constant adjustment, emotional translation, or self-regulation. Over time, this asymmetry shifts energy allocation. One brain invests more because it receives stability. The other withdraws because stability costs too much effort. This divergence often goes unnoticed because it unfolds gradually. The person whose love deepens experiences the bond as increasingly natural and grounding. The person whose love fades experiences subtle fatigue rather than dissatisfaction. Thoughts arrive less frequently. Emotional signals carry less weight. There is no dramatic turning point, only a slow reduction in engagement. The brain conserves resources by stepping back from a system that no longer supports ease. This withdrawal is not a decision, it is an adjustment. Communication alone cannot always resolve this difference, because the source is not misunderstanding, but regulation. One person may express love, commitment, and presence, yet the other's nervous system still experiences friction. The brain responds to felt safety, not verbal reassurance. When reassurance does not translate into regulation, attachment weakens despite intention. Love fades not because it is unwanted, but because it is no longer sustainable at a physiological level. Meanwhile, the partner whose nervous system remains regulated may feel confused by the change. Their brain continues to associate the bond with calm and continuity. Oxytocin maintains attachment, making disengagement feel unnecessary or even threatening. Love deepens because nothing signals the need to withdraw. The mismatch becomes painful not because one person cares more, but because their systems are receiving different information from the same environment. Over time, this asymmetry can create emotional imbalance. One partner moves closer, seeking restoration, while the other moves inward, seeking relief. The more one pursues, the more effort the other experiences. This dynamic accelerates divergence, reinforcing deepening on one side and fading on the other. Neither process is wrong. Each nervous system is acting to preserve its own balance. Love does not fail here, regulation diverges. Listening now, there is no need to assign blame or search for explanation. The brain understands that love responds to regulation, not fairness. Awareness of this softens judgment and releases urgency. Thought slows because it no longer needs to fix asymmetry. The nervous system relaxes when it recognizes that fading and deepening are parallel outcomes of the same adaptive intelligence. And in that recognition, the mind settles, allowing rest to arrive gently, without resistance, as sleep naturally follows understanding rather than effort. Sometimes, love does not fade because it weakens, but because it has completed its function. The brain does not hold on to bonds indefinitely out of sentiment. it holds on to them as long as they continue to regulate the nervous system. When a relationship has taught what it needed to teach, stabilized what it could stabilize, and revealed what it was meant to reveal, the brain slowly begins to disengage. This disengagement is not punishment or loss. It is closure at a physiological level. The system senses that no further adaptation is required, and it gently releases attention so that energy can be redistributed elsewhere. Ending becomes necessary when maintaining connection demands more regulation than it provides. The nervous system is sensitive to imbalance, even when the mind resists acknowledging it. If emotional effort consistently outweighs emotional return, the brain begins to experience fatigue. This fatigue is quiet and cumulative. It does not announce itself as a decision. It appears as emotional heaviness, reduced curiosity, or a subtle desire for distance. Love fades here not because care is gone, but because the system needs relief from ongoing internal work. The brain is not designed to endure prolonged dysregulation for the sake of attachment. Survival depends on flexibility. When a bond no longer supports equilibrium, the brain prepares to release it in order to preserve adaptability. This preparation often happens beneath awareness, making endings feel confusing or sudden when they finally surface. In reality, the nervous system has been adjusting for a long time, slowly withdrawing investment to protect itself from overload. Ending is not failure. It is an adaptive response. There are moments when love must end to allow the nervous system to recalibrate. Continuing would reinforce patterns that no longer serve regulation, growth, or coherence. The brain recognizes when repetition becomes stagnation. When learning plateaus and stress persists, the system seeks change. This is not restlessness, it is self-preservation. Love that once supported evolution can eventually limit it. Ending becomes the only way to restore balance and reopen the possibility of new adaptation. Importantly, endings do not erase meaning. The brain stores completed bonds differently from unresolved ones. When love ends at the right time, it integrates smoothly into memory. There is sadness, but not fragmentation. The nervous system processes loss without collapse because the bond has reached completion. Meaning remains intact even as attachment dissolves. Love does not disappear. It changes form, becoming a reference rather than a requirement. Resistance to ending often comes from the mind, not the nervous system. The mind fears loss of identity, routine, or imagined futures. The body, however, recognizes relief when release is appropriate. When awareness aligns with this recognition, the ending feels less like abandonment and more like exhalation. Tension decreases. Energy returns. The system begins to reorganize itself around new possibilities. Ending becomes not an interruption of life, but a continuation of it in a different configuration. Listening now, there is nothing you need to let go of or hold on to. The brain understands when cycles complete. Love fades when it has finished its work and deepens when it continues to regulate. Neither outcome is wrong. Both are expressions of the same intelligence seeking balance. As this understanding settles, urgency dissolves, thought slows, emotional weight lightens. And in that lightness, awareness drifts gently inward, where endings and beginnings no longer need interpretation, allowing the mind to rest quietly and fall into sleep without resistance. In the end, love does not ask to be judged, explained, or solved. It simply follows the quiet intelligence of the nervous system as it moves toward balance. Whether love fades or deepens is not a moral outcome, not a reward or a failure, but a physiological conclusion. The brain continuously measures effort against regulation, tension against relief, movement against rest. When love deepens, it is because the system can remain itself within the bond without strain. When love fades, it is because remaining requires more energy than the nervous system can sustain. Both outcomes are expressions of self-preservation, not of loss. What makes endings difficult is not the disappearance of love, but the mind's resistance to completion. Conscious thought prefers continuity, narrative, and certainty. The nervous system prefers coherence. When coherence is no longer present, the brain gently withdraws investment, even if the mind is not ready to follow. This delay creates confusion and pain, but the process itself remains calm beneath the surface. Love ends quietly in the body long before it ends in thought. By the time awareness notices, the system has already begun to rest. Deepening, on the other hand, feels uneventful. There is no dramatic shift, no defining moment. Love becomes something you no longer think about because it no longer requires attention. The nervous system remains regulated without effort. Presence replaces anticipation. Attachment stops activating urgency and starts supporting stillness. Love deepens when it becomes invisible, when it no longer needs to announce itself through emotion, fear, or desire. What remains is stability, carried lightly rather than held tightly. Both fading and deepening share the same destination: integration. The brain does not leave experiences unresolved when it can avoid it. It seeks closure, whether through continuation or release. When love integrates, it becomes part of the internal landscape rather than an active force. Memory stores it without charge. Emotion recalls it without disruption. The system completes the cycle and moves forward without fragmentation. This completion is what allows peace to follow connection. There is no need to rush this process. The nervous system adapts at its own pace, guided by experience rather than instruction. Trying to force love to continue exhausts the system. Trying to force it to end creates resistance. Balance emerges when awareness allows the process to unfold without interference. Love does not require control to reach its conclusion. It only requires space. As you listen now, nothing inside needs to decide whether love should stay or go. The brain already knows how to complete what it begins. Thought can release its grip. Emotion can soften. The body can rest. Understanding does not demand action. It invites stillness. In that stillness, everything settles where it belongs, without effort or struggle. And as this final understanding drifts through awareness, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to resolve. The system has arrived. Breathing deepens, muscles release. Thought stretches and fades. Love no longer moves forward or backward. It rests. And in that rest, the mind follows naturally, slipping gently into sleep, carried not by meaning or memory, but by quiet balance itself.